Just before starting the Sicha, we'll just go through a few of the psukim that the Rebbe is dealing with in the Sicha, and that will help us to be able to understand what the Rebbe is saying. So in the very, very end of the parsha, the pasuk says, Moshe Rabbeinu goes up onto the mountain, and the cloud covers the mountain. Rashi actually gives us two opinions over here when this is even talking about. Is this talking about the days before Matan Torah, or is this talking about right after Matan Torah? The pasuk goes on to say how the glory of Hashem is on Har Sinai, and Vayichaseu ha'onon, which again, based on these two opinions, whether it's referring to the cloud covering the mountain or covering Moshe Rabbeinu. So the pasuk says covered for 6 days. Hashem calls out to Moshe Rabbeinu on the 7th day from the cloud. Then the pasuk says the glory of Hashem was like a fire on the top of the mountain in front of the eyes of all the Bnei Yisrael. Moshe Rabbeinu comes into the cloud and he goes up to the mountain, and Moshe Rabbeinu is on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights. So the Rebbe starts off the Sicha by quoting this last pasuk, where at the end of the parsha it says B'soicha Onan, that Moshe Rabbeinu goes into the cloud, and says that Rashi tells us that Onan Zed, this cloud, was Kimin Oshan, was like a smoke. And in the next Sif, the Rebbe is going to elaborate more and bring more of this Rashi. And the Rebbe's first questions are that seemingly we know the concept of an Onan. Onan is a cloud. That's usually the way it's translated. Now Oshan is smoke, and these are seemingly completely separate things. Not only that, but they're actually opposites to each other. Onan comes from water, whereas Oshan, smoke, is coming from fire. So says the Rebbe, first of all, where is Rashi even getting this from? That Onan over here should be translated, or is different than the way it's usually a cloud. Here it's like a smoke. And secondly, says the Rebbe, what's even the problem, what's even the question in Pshut Shal Mikra that Rashi needs to come to explain? Then now the Rebbe goes on and quotes the next part of the Rashi, that Hashem makes for Moshe Rabbeinu a shvil, a special path inside of this Onan. The Rebbe says the source for this is in the Gemara. But in the Gemara, it's actually coming to answer a contradiction that seemingly is between two psukim. We have one pasuk, which is a pasuk much later on in Parshas Pekudei, where the pasuk says Moshe Rabbeinu is not able to go into the Oyel Moed because there's a cloud resting over the Oyel Moed. On the other hand, we have over here the pasuk where it says Moshe Rabbeinu is able to go into the cloud. So is Moshe Rabbeinu able to come into a cloud or not? For this, says the Gemara, that in the yeshiva of Rabbi Shmuel who was taught, that the pasuk says over here that Moshe Rabbeinu comes b'soich ha'onan. What's this word b'soich? So we learn from another pasuk where it says b'soich. This is by Kriyas Yamsuf, where the Yidden go b'soich hayam. Now there we know that Hashem made a path for the Bnei Yisrael in the midst of the sea, as the pasuk says, "V'hamayim lo'em choyma." The water was like a wall for the Jewish people on the right and on the left, so there's a path in between. So says the Gemara, so too over here Hashem makes a special path for Moshe Rabbeinu inside the cloud. So that's in the Gemara. But in Rashi, we can't say that this is what bothering Rashi as well, this contradiction of the psukim, because this contradiction will only come up later when the pasuk will say, "V'lo yochel Moshe," that Moshe Rabbeinu is not able to go into the Oyel Moed because of the cloud. This is a pasuk again only later in Parshas Pekudei. So if anything, Rashi should have dealt with this contradiction over there rather than over here. So we must say that what Rashi is bothered by, or Rashi is coming to answer, is how is Moshe Rabbeinu able to come into a cloud? And that's why Moshe, in other words, not because of the other pasuk, it's just within this pasuk itself. And this is what Rashi is saying, that Hashem makes him a special path. And it's not only because later there will be this pasuk of Lo Yochel Moshe Lavoy, that Moshe Rabbeinu can't come into the Oyel Moed because of the cloud. Rather, it's because we have a difficulty right over here. How could Moshe Rabbeinu be entering the cloud? So the question on this is, seemingly there shouldn't be any problem of Moshe Rabbeinu going through a cloud. Rashi had told us already earlier, this is in Parshas Yisro, on the pasuk of Moshe Nigash El Ho'arafel, Moshe approaches the Arafel, which is usually translated as a fog. Rashi says Moshe Rabbeinu enters 3 partitions, Choshech, darkness, Onan, a cloud, Va'arafel. In other words, Moshe Rabbeinu is able to cross, able to pass not only the Choshech, the darkness of the cloud, but even Arafel. What's Arafel? Rashi himself tells us it means Avon, and it means a really thick cloud. And yet over there, Rashi had no problem and didn't have to tell us how could Moshe Rabbeinu go through this. which tells us that Ben Chamish Lemikra has no difficulty with this. How is Moshe Rabbeinu able to go through a cloud? The Rebbe says we see this practically and clearly. There's no problem to go through a cloud even if there's no special path. So why is it suddenly over here that Rashi is bothered by this going through the cloud, where Rashi has to give us an explanation and tell us that Hashem makes a special path for him? So the Rebbe says the explanation is, what's bothering Rashi in Pshutei Shel Mikra is that, as we quoted before, these psukim started with a pasuk Vayechas ha'onan es hahar, that the cloud covers the mountain. If that's the case, it's then quite simple and obvious that when the pasuk says Moshe Rabbeinu goes up onto the mountain, clearly he's going into the cloud. So why does the pasuk now say suddenly again, Vayavai Moshe, Moshe Rabbeinu is going B'soich ha'onan, in the cloud? We know there was a cloud. If it says Moshe Rabbeinu went up on the mountain, then clearly it was in the cloud. Before dealing with this, the Rebbe now looks, in the square brackets, the Rebbe looks at the words Vayal Elohar. Isn't this also seemingly redundant? Why does the pasuk have to repeat the words Vayal Elohar if it said before already Moshe Rabbeinu went onto the mountain? So the Rebbe explains this, that this is not a problem, and the Rebbe looks at both opinions that Rashi brought before on that pasuk that we quoted right in the beginning. According to the first opinion, since Vayavai Moshe, that Moshe Rabbeinu comes and he goes up, etc., is on the day of Matan Torah, so we can understand why the pasuk is repeating it again, because in between, the pasuk had interrupted with some things that happened before Matan Torah. The pasuk says Vayechaseyu, that it covered him for 6 days, which Rashi, according to that opinion, again explains that this is going from Rosh Chodesh until Matan Torah. Hashem calls out to Moshe Rabbeinu on the 7th day. So therefore, because we had these few psukim in between with some things that happened during those days, so the pasuk is now repeating again that Moshe Rabbeinu is going up on the mountain. So that's not a problem why it says that he goes up again. Certainly, says the Rebbe, according to the other opinion, the Vayal is actually a different Vayal. It's not the same one. The first time, it's speaking about the Moshe Rabbeinu goes up right after Matan Torah, and now when the pasuk is repeating Vayavi Moshe b'soich ha'onan Vayal Elohar, is going to be the 7th day. In other words, it's a number of days after Matan Torah, so it's a different Vayal. But why does the pasuk have to say again that it's in a cloud? We know that there was a cloud on the mountain. Says the Rebbe, that itself tells us, when the pasuk is saying b'soich ha'onan, in this pasuk, it's not referring to the same cloud that was mentioned in the earlier psukim. And therefore the question arises, what is this cloud all about? And that's why Rashi tells us that Onan Zed, this cloud, meaning the cloud that's being discussed over here, not the cloud that was mentioned earlier. The previous cloud was a regular cloud. But this Onan is Kamin Oshan, was more like a smoke. In other words, the cloud that was mentioned in the earlier psukim and in the earlier parshas, in fact, Rashi didn't explain anything what it is, because that's understood simply. That's an Onan, means a cloud. This is the cloud in which Hashem's glory is, so to speak, being expressed and coming into. And just like we know, when the pasuk said is about the Amud Ha'onan, the pillar of smoke, this pillar of cloud, that accompanied the Yidden, the pasuk says, "V'Hashem hoylech lefneim yoyim." Hashem was going in front of the Yidden during the day with that cloud, and at night with a fire to illuminate for them. In all of these cases, a cloud means simply a cloud. Says Rashi, but in our pasuk, the Onan must be something else. Because as we said, the pasuk would have said already earlier that there was a cloud on the mountain. So Rashi says here we must be saying something, it's referring to something else. And Rashi therefore says that Onan Zeh, when it says Onan over here, we're speaking about Kimin Oshan, it was more similar to a smoke. Now why should Rashi say, yes, it's different, but why like smoke? Says the Rebbe, what's forcing Rashi to say this is what says in the previous psukim, within these psukim itself. The Rebbe says, between the pasuk of Vayikra el Moshe, that Hashem calls out to Moshe, and then it says Moshe Rabbeinu comes into the cloud, we have the following pasuk, which we quoted earlier. Umare kvoid Hashem, the glory of Hashem, the sight of the glory of Hashem was like a consuming fire at the top of the mountain. And the question is, this pasuk seemingly should have said before Vayikra el Moshe. So it says Vayikra el Moshe, Hashem calls to Moshe and then starts describing about the glory of Hashem like a consuming fire. Seemingly this should have been before, when it said that the glory of Hashem was resting on the mountain, etc. It should have described how it's Ka'esh Echel, it's like a consuming fire. Why is it being said now, after it says that Hashem calls out to Moshe Rabbeinu on the seventh day from the cloud? And again, the Rebbe looks in the square brackets over here at the two opinions that we mentioned before. The Rebbe says, needless to say, according to the opinion that Vayikra El Moshe was on the seventh day after Matan Torah, where Hashem is calling to Moshe Rabbeinu to go up onto the mountain to get the Luchos. So Vayavai Moshe, when it says Moshe Rabbeinu goes into the cloud, so this is in response to this calling of Hashem. So then definitely there doesn't seem to fit between the Vayikra El Moshe and Moshe Rabbeinu coming up, fulfilling this call, that in the middle it should say, Umari Kvoid Hashem, describing how the glory of Hashem, or the sight of Hashem, is like a consuming fire. Says the Rebbe, even according to the first opinion, that Vayikra El Moshe is referring to before Matan Torah, it's Hashem calling out to Moshe Rabbeinu actually to say the Aseres HaDibros. And in fact, it wasn't only to Moshe Rabbeinu. Hashem is going to say the Aseres HaDibros, of course, to all the Yidden. This is just a special honor that Hashem is giving Moshe Rabbeinu, calling out to him. And it's not that Hashem is calling him now to go to the mountain. And therefore, when it does say later, Vayavi Moshe b'soicha onan, it's actually a separate point. This is not related to Hashem calling out to him. Nevertheless, it would still seem to fit that the words Umari Kvoid Hashem should have said earlier, not after Hashem calling to Moshe, but earlier when we speak about Hashem's glory on the mountain. So again, just to summarize the point we're up to, the question is, Hashem calls to Moshe. First it speaks about Hashem's glory resting on the mountain. And then it says, Hashem calls to Moshe. And then suddenly it's describing again Hashem being like a consuming fire. This pasuk should have said earlier. Therefore, says Rashi, this pasuk, when it's describing Hashem like a consuming fire, is actually here because it's about to describe Moshe Rabbeinu coming into the cloud, and this is an introduction to that pasuk. The pasuk is telling us over here how this cloud is actually different than the previous cloud of the previous pasuk. Oh, it says earlier in the psukim. And that's why, as we said before, the pasuk is about to tell us again, Moshe Rabbeinu comes into a cloud, which we said is a different cloud. In what way is this cloud different? Because it's as a result of what we just said, that Hashem is appearing like an Eishei Cheles, like a consuming fire. And therefore the cloud that follows afterwards, says Rashi, is like a smoke. Because where smoke comes from? Smoke is coming from a consuming fire. In other words, now we understand the flow of the psukim again. Earlier on it spoke about a cloud, that was a simple cloud. Then the pasuk starts speaking about a consuming fire and then mentions again a cloud which seemingly didn't have to be mentioned. We now understand this cloud is coming as a result of the fire, and therefore Rashi is telling us that it's like a smoke. Says the Rebbe, now we can also understand the diuk in the pasuk. Why, when we want to describe the glory of Hashem, we understand we want to describe it as a fire. Why does it have to sound like a consuming fire? We want to describe the glory of Hashem, the sight of Hashem. It's enough to say that it's like a fire. So what's this idea of emphasizing Ka'eshei Cheles? But now we understand it very simply. Since the point of the pasuk is coming to explain what does it mean when it says in the next pasuk, Vayavai Moshe b'soicha onan, that this cloud is not just an ordinary cloud, it means smoke, and that's coming from this great sight of the glory of Hashem. So that's what, which was like a fire. So the pasuk needs to explain and say, because it was Ka'eshei Cheles, like a consuming fire. Because where does smoke come from? It's not coming just from the fire. It doesn't come from fire alone, from fire itself. It's coming from when fire is consuming, destroying, and burning something, whatever the fire is, whatever the fuel of that fire is, that's what's causing the smoke. In fact, says the Rebbe, the truth of the matter is, generally the fire of above is not Eishei Cheles, is not consuming, like we had by the sneh, that Moshe Rabbeinu sees the sneh on fire, and yet it's not being consumed. And that's specifically why the pasuk has to emphasize and say that in this case it was Eishei Cheles, it was a consuming fire, which therefore would be producing smoke. Says the Rebbe, now we could also finally understand why Hashem makes a special path for Moshe Rabbeinu, and why Rashi has to tell us that there was a path made for Moshe Rabbeinu in this Anon, specifically in this Anon, which was like a smoke, different to all the other clouds, which we never had to say that there was a path made. Says the Rebbe, if Anon over here in our pasuk would mean like all the other psukim, that it means a cloud, so therefore, of course, there's no need to say why Hashem needs to make a special way for Moshe Rabbeinu to go through the cloud. As we said before, Moshe Rabbeinu was even able to go through the Arafel through a thick cloud. But since we're now saying that the Onan over here is really more of a smoke, now smoke, because of the soot that's inside of it and the things that are being burnt, the fuel that's being burnt up by it, what usually happens when someone goes through smoke or something goes through smoke, it's going to become all smoky, all black, all dark, both the person that's going through and his clothes. And therefore, says the Rebbe, there could be a tremendous question. How is it possible that Moshe Rabbeinu should be looking completely blackened by the smoke as he goes up to the mountain to speak to Hashem to receive the luchos, which would seemingly be completely not a covered away to go to Hashem? As the Rebbe points out in the Ha'aris, we know before davening, a person has to wash himself, etc. This is why Rashi says that Hashem made a special path for Moshe Rabbeinu through the smoke. So Moshe Rabbeinu is able to go through this path in a way that the smoke itself is not impacting him in any way. Says the Rebbe, the question still remains. Number one, why then does Rashi say that it's like a smoke? Seemingly, if it's a consuming fire has smoke, so then it's literally smoke. Why only like a smoke? Also, why does the pasuk then describe it as an onon, as a cloud, rather than just saying that Moshe Rabbeinu comes into the smoke? Says the Rebbe, the explanation is, Har Sinai, as we know, is in the desert, Midbar Sinai, especially the very top of the mountain. That's where the glory of Hashem was like a consuming fire. So this is a place where there are no trees and plants and grass growing. This is a place of stones, earth, dust. Now smoke is specifically, as we said before, when it's consuming something that can be consumed, something that's regularly burnt up, like, for example, trees will produce lots of smoke. But this obviously doesn't apply when there's a fire going on in the doimim, in the inanimate, like the stones in the earth. This is why Rashi says that this was not a literally regular smoke, but rather kiminosh, and it was like smoke. In other words, the cloud, the onon, that which is coming as a result of the burning up of the doimim over here on Har Sinai was just like smoke. In other words, like a regular smoke that comes up from plants that are being burnt up from the ash, from the fire. In this case, it's only similar to that. It's not the same kind of smoke. Says the Rebbe, because this is not a regular, natural kind of smoke, that's also why the Torah doesn't refer to it as Ashan, but calls it an Anon. The Rebbe now turns to Yeinu Shel Torah, to the Chassidus, which we could find in this Rashi. And the Rebbe says, the idea of the smoke by Matan Torah, by Har Sinai, by Matan Torah, actually we have a pasuk clearly in Parshas Yisro about smoke on Har Sinai. By Har Sinai, Ashan Kuloi was completely in smoke because Hashem came down with it in fire. Yet in our Parsha, the pasuk uses the term Anon. It's a cloud. So what's going on? The Rebbe explains. The idea of smoke, as we said before, is coming from the thing that's being burnt up, because we have something, a physical, materialistic thing, and the fire is consuming it, and that is causing the smoke to come out. But says the Rebbe, if that's the case, there's going to be different kinds of smoke, different levels in smoke. It's going to depend on the material that's being burnt up. When the thing being burnt up is something of a more refined, a thinner and smaller type of thing, which is going to burn quicker also, so then the smoke itself is going to be not so thick, not so coarse. It's going to be a more of a thin and refined type of smoke. On the other hand, when what's being burnt up is going to be something thicker, something bigger, and is going to burn for longer, as we said, so also the smoke is going to be a much, much thicker, coarser, heavier, bigger smoke. Says the Rebbe, from this we understand that when you look at the smoke in any particular case of anything, this is actually going to express to what extent the thing being burnt up, how thick or coarse it is, that's going to be expressed in how much is being consumed, the way it's being consumed. And the Rebbe says, just like that's true b'gashmi, is the same thing is true b'ruchnius. When we speak about things in this world being consumed, so to speak, becoming bottled, completely nullified and absorbed in elikus. As a result of a great revelation and fire from above, so the yeshus, the metzius of the world itself is being consumed, is being taken away from its existence, and it's coming to a level of nullification and connection and being consumed inside of Hashem with a complete yearning and desire, etc. And Beruchni that's the concept of Oshan. That's the concept of a smoke representing that the Yeshus of the world is completely being nullified right now. But now we're going to have a difference, and now we're going to understand the difference between these psukim. The first pasuk that's discussing by Matan Torah, when it said Vahar Sinai Oshan Kulei, the whole mountain is smoking. This is speaking about at the time of Matan Torah, since the Gilui Alikus of Matan Torah was in a way of Milmaila Lamata, was from above. As the pasuk says, it's Asher Yarad Hashem, Allah Hashem, Bo'esh Hashem came down with it in fire. In other words, it's a Gilui only coming from above, whereas the world itself was still very physical, very materialistic. It's not so refined yet. So therefore, the Gilui Alikus, that godly revelation that's happening from the world becoming nullified and absorbed in Alikus, is in a way of a Har Sinai Oshan Kule, which means the whole mountain is on smoke. There's a lot of smoke. There's tremendous amount of smoke, which represents this idea that the world itself was, as we said, a more coarse thing, not so refined yet, and therefore there's more smoke. On the other hand, in our parsha, where we're speaking already in the time after Matan Torah, after the world was elevated, refined through Matan Torah, that had an impact on the world already, so the world itself is not so thick and coarse anymore. And therefore, when the pasuk says, "Mari kvoid Hashem koeshta," the sight of the glory of Hashem was like fire, and it causes an unknown. We said, in other words, it's not mamish a smoke. Rather, the Rebbe is quoting now from the Alter Rebbe in Torah Ord, because it's so thin, it's not being called an oshon. It's not being called smoke. It's being called an unknown. It's being called a cloud, which represents that there isn't so much this idea of so much of that world being consumed. There's much less of the world, so to speak. There isn't that much this idea of aliyah mulmata l'mayla. Comes along Rashi in Yenish Shal Torah, and he reveals, no, this cloud is also like a smoke. Meaning to say that its idea is not only about a Gilui Alikus milamayla, as similar to the way the cloud was in the previous psukim, but rather, this cloud is coming also as a result of the fire, the glory of Hashem, which is like a fire. In other words, the Elikus is being poil, a certain bittul in the Metzius of the world. But Rashi says it's Kimin Oshan. What does this mean? In other words, even in this case, there is still some sort of smoke. What is smoke? Smoke is representing, in other words, there is still some sort of dust, some sort of the soot that we said before, some sort of the dust that's happening as a result, and the ashes that's happening as a result of materialism being consumed. What does this mean? Since the purpose of Torah is to make the world a place for Hashem, and therefore this onon in this case, which Moshe Rabbeinu needs to go through to receive the luchos, to receive the Torah and then bring it down below, is kimin oshan. In other words, it's also a gilui from above that's causing some sort of nullification in the world. So what's the difference between this one and the previous oshan? So the Rebbe explains, being that it's after the gilui of Matan Torah, which already caused the general purification in the world, the general bittul in the materialism of the world. So therefore, it's not the same kind of oshan, the same thick smoke, so to speak, as we said before in the beginning of Matan Torah, but rather it's only kimin oshan, it's only similar to a smoke, but still some smoke there is, because the whole point is taking the world and bringing it closer to Hashem. And the Rebbe now concludes with the Hayro in our Avodah. The Rebbe says there are some people that argue, why do I have to get involved with the lowliest things? If I even have to lower myself down, isn't it enough, or it should be enough, that I'm getting involved with things that are more like the level of the animal, chai, or even plants? But to go to those areas of the world which are the lowest, like in the category of doimim, of the inanimate, in other words, the things that are the most coarse and materialistic, things that seemingly don't show any sort of vitality, any sort of chayas, any sort of life. In fact, these are things that even when the fire of Hashem is shining on its own, it doesn't have the nature to be a keli, to become completely burnt up by this fire, to be caught up by this fire. The Rebbe quotes over here a Zohar that the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, that sometimes when something is so thick and coarse, you need to break it up first. So seemingly this is the lowliest of the low, this is the doimim. And yet we say that we need to cause that smoke. We need to cause that elevation even in these lowliest things of the doimim of the world. Because this is the whole purpose of Matan Torah, that this idea of the oshon, the smoke, the consumption and the aliyah, this elevation of the materialism of the world should be accomplished not only in the tzoymeach and the plant, but even in the mountain, even in that level of doimim. Says the Rebbe, but one could still argue, there's a concept called amisabek imenuvel. If you start wrestling and fighting with someone that's dirty, you're going to get dirty yourself by the avodah of trying to get this oshon, this smoke, even into these lowliest things. So it's very possible that we might get messed up ourselves. In other words, we might get dirty ourselves, soiled ourselves. So isn't it better not to get involved with these things? So the Rebbe says 2 points. Number one, as Rashi says, Hashem made a path for Moshe Rabbeinu inside, which means that each and every one of us have a Moshe Rabbeinu inside of us, the neshama of the Yid, and it will never get soiled, it will never get messed up, it always remains clean. Because it's always going through a path, there's always this idea that it's connected to Hashem, it's always faithful to Hashem, and is never really soiled and blackened, and never impacted. But the Rebbe says furthermore, even in the more revealed faculties of the person, not only the neshama, really don't get black and soiled from that smoke, because in truth, let's look at the words of Rashi. Rashi says, Kiminosh, and it's only like a smoke. It's not really black, dirty smoke. It's only seemingly looking like smoke. In other words, the fact that the world could even seem to be a blockage, a concealment al-likus, is only kimin, it's only there so that we should be able to have the concept of free choice, because clearly if we see right away the emes, there would be no room for truth. And therefore it's only kiminosh, and it only seems to be that there's a blockage of the world. Furthermore, says the Rebbe, since the whole point of concealment is always there for a purpose of kedusha, in truth, if we look at this ocean, what is it really? It's really an onan, it's really a cloud of kedusha. In other words, yes, it looks like ocean, it looks like smoke, it looks like something materialistic, that even after it's burnt up, there's still some blackness, there's still some dirt, which may cause the person to become dirty. But that's only what it seems like to our eyes of flesh, to our physical eyes. But the Pnimi is what it's really is a cloud of Kedusha. Because the whole purpose of it, l'chatchila, was only that there could be an additional light in Kedusha. Says the Rebbe, here is the Hira, that we must get involved and go through this oshon, so to speak, this smoke. And only through that can one go ahead and receive the Torah. Moshe Rabbeinu after this goes and receives the Luchos. And that's referring both to Moshe Rabbeinu, and so to in each and every one of us, the Moshe inside of us, receiving the Torah after this introduction, that Moshe Rabbeinu gets involved and goes through this anon. And this anon, as we said, was more like a smoke, and he needs a path to go through it, but it's specifically through this that he has to go. And even though, yes, temporarily, on the external level, it seems to be a concealment, but it's specifically through this, as the Pasuk goes on to say, that he's on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights and gets the Torah in its entirety. And then he brings this down also into his own body, into his own portion in the world. And this is as it says right after Mishpotim. We go into Parshas Truma, where it says, V'asuli migdash v'shachanti b'soichem. We take from the physical things, from the gold and the silver. We make it a holy place for Hashem, a mikdash for Hashem. And through this is fulfilled the kavanah, the purpose, that the Hashem has created the world, because Nes'ava HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Hashem had a desire, liyos lo yizbarech, to have a dwelling place down here in the lowliest world.